If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed. What is the long-term effect of too much information?
Information, I just need some information. I've been dying. Is it lack of education? I've been reading without any transformation. I'm addicted. Is it overstimulation? Hey.
Welcome to the Sixth Sense Report.
Hear ye, come one, come all. You're listening to the Sixth Sense Report with Joel Nikoloff and Darnell Samuels.
Did you ever have a fear of being homeless?
Not really. I've thought about it. But,
you thought about running away?
No, not running away. not running away, but just what would I do? What would I do to survive? It's crossed my mind, but yeah, my heart definitely goes out to those who actually have to live that life. Yeah, no, it's not easy. But yeah, man, we are going to talk about the alternate shelters that have opened up while on COVID. So
yeah, and it leads to an interesting sort of conversation because of the response, right? I mean, in general, there's an article from this CBC that just talks about homeless people in tents in the parks and the residents near those parks feeling unsafe from these people being around.
Because so for the listeners who don't know, of course because of COVID-19, the shelters have to practice social distancing. So there are 30 new shelter locations that have opened up in the last 6 months within the greater Toronto area. And so basically what you're having now is people from shelters are being put in residential, nicer neighborhoods and mixing with them. And there's been a lot of pushback from the residents of these areas. And they're saying, not in my backyard. NIMBYism, as we like to call it. So, so
I'd never heard that term.
Yeah,
NIMBYism, I've heard, man. Not in my backyard, but I didn't know it was NIMBYism. An ism.
Hey, man, don't be a NIMBY. Right. So we're gonna talk about NIMBYism for the first half of the episode, and then the latter half we're gonna talk about gentrification, because those are two different concepts as it relates to location and finding a home. So for example, NIMBYism is when somebody wants to move in the area and you don't want them there, hence not in my backyard. And then and I mean it's not just like we'll get to that. Yeah, we'll get to that, but that's just an overview. Gentrification has to do with people being forced out because of the new people coming in.
Yep. So, and the reason I was pushing back on your definition of NIMBYism, because to some extent it goes down to the simplest idea of your neighbor changing or getting an exemption on how they use their property. That also is like, well, no, not in my backyard, right? Like, no, you can't do that. You're going to affect my property value. So you talked about people moving into the neighborhood, which is like, sort of, I think, a different level. People might kind of get a little bit worried, but
you know what? Sorry, maybe I don't want to misrepresent what NIMBYism is. So it's in a sense, yes, where it's people, but also businesses and infrastructure where you can, where you as a community can say, hey, look, we don't want
Walmart.
We don't want you to build a shelter in my backyard.
Yeah.
Or this or a strip
Walmart,
club,
right?
Or Walmart, a strip club,
whatever it is, right?
Yeah, a church, a mosque. We don't want it. So that's actually a thing.
And I mean, there's, it's an interesting conversation around, should that even be allowed, right? Is that even appropriate? And what I mean by that is, should the citizen, is it, and I only say it as like, again, I always look at the more fundamental question, right? Is this the best way forward? And there's a paper from, I think it's 2000. I'm just scrolling to the front of it. Yeah, January 2000. Why are there NIMBYs? It's actually a really good article. I think it was a guy who was on like a zoning board, and really I would argue he sort of misses the more fundamental question, but he sort of speaks to, what's the cause, but and the reason I said, the more fundamental question is, how much influence should I have on my neighbor and how they use their property? Because clearly, NIMBYism or people who are saying not in my backyard feel very much entitled to how the property or the property in their city is utilized.
Mm-hmm. Now, mind you, there was a reporting on this issue from Global News, and we'll have the link in our show notes. And so it talks about, yes, the residents near Toronto shelters upset with lack of city consultation. And so basically the issue is this: the people are saying, hey, look, let us, we should have a say in, where the shelters pop up. But the city is saying, well, no, this isn't negotiable. You don't have a right to tell us where to place the people, because your property is your property, and whatever's not your property, you don't have a say over it. And so that way the government, who's advocating on behalf of the homeless, is saying, no, they're going to be in this hotel, or they're going to be in this hotel next to your residence, or even share your residence. Who knows?
Yeah, and I think the safety, right? Because that global video sort of speaks to hey, some of the people were accosting other people, verbally abusing, right? So I think, and in my opinion, when you're living in your house and all of a sudden the government makes a change that now your neighborhood no longer feels safe, or let's just say the government fails to protect your property rights such that you don't feel safe. Arguably, that's the one proper role of government, is to prevent injustice from reigning, i.e. Frederick Bastiat, by protecting your property rights. Because arguably anytime an injustice occurs, it's because there's been a violation of property rights, including your person as a property. So I think there's sort of a little bit more of the not in my backyard argument that I really can appreciate, when your argument is, I don't feel safe, and someone else outside of me or someone has changed the circumstance or abdicated. I can't say the word properly. Whatever.
Abdicated?
They've abdicated their responsibility for protecting your property rights, right? So,
well, hold on. Well, that's the thing. Because in the video, everybody's saying, well, I want to feel safe in my neighborhood. I no longer feel safe. So protecting, you step outside, that's the chances you take, but they're not violating you in your home.
Yeah, their argument is I used to be able to sit on the, if they're in an apartment building, they used to be able to sit downstairs in front of their apartment and it'd be peaceful. And now it's no longer peaceful and safe.
Yeah. But also I'd like to add, it's funny because I was watching the video, and, a lot of people will watch this and they'll be like, oh, and you see, these old white ladies talking about yo, it's not safe anymore, and this and this and that, and then you would say, oh yeah, this is white privilege here and this and that, and then the next clip you have this black lady and she's like, look, man, I paid my money to be safe.
I paid good money to live in this neighborhood,
and that's it. And that, she's just like, look, man, I paid good money for this to be safe. And so the point I'm making is that this is not a privilege issue. I believe it is a property rights issue, because it isn't just white people who own nice property. Believe it or not, there's brown people and black people that own nice property and don't want no trouble. And so part of it is these people work hard to buy places that they can feel comfortable in.
Yeah, I know that living in a safe neighborhood when you have children is probably safe, as well as other kids to play with, are probably two of your biggest priorities when you have young children, or children in general. So I think if any of our listeners are kind of like, oh, whatever, you can protect yourself. Well, sometimes you're not just thinking about yourself, right? You're thinking about those others that you're not going to be around all the time to protect.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. And you want to be able to, let your kids go out and ride their bike on the street or whatever the case may be. And you know what? The issue isn't necessarily the homeless, or that they're ex-cons, that really isn't necessarily the argument you're hearing. Oh, you have ex-cons living next to you, but you have those who are not mentally well. That was a concern.
Yeah, I think, I mean, obviously we don't want to diminish the fact that the homeless and those that are, in need are something that there's obviously, we as a community have a responsibility, and I think the listener would know how I think the responsibility should be handled, but we're not trying to diminish that. I think we're just trying to steel man the argument for why they, can arguably justify or arguably have a strong position. So I just thought, to your point, coming back to the mental health component of this. Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you. Have you ever dealt with someone who you just were like, I have no idea what they're going to do next because they don't seem mentally stable?
Oh yeah. Oh man. Well, I go to church.
Oh yeah.
I go to church at Jarvis. What do you mean?
What about that knock at your door?
Oh yeah. Well, yes. In my little residential neighborhood, but mental health issues, because like my church is next to the oldest men's shelter in Canada. And so we're right across the street from that shelter. And so you have a lot of
I think
people.
My brother-in-law works at that shelter.
Oh, yo, it's heavy over there, man. It's serious business. I'll Google it so you guys can look it up and be like, oh. But yeah, so basically the people from the shelter come over to my church a lot, or even not just my church, but you see them on the street. If I go to Harvey's, I'm running into them. If I'm going to go to Tim Hortons, I'm running into them. So yeah, their behavior is sporadic as anybody who's having serious mental health issues, and it is what it is. But again, I think especially, dealing with this period of Corona and Black Lives Matter and fear is a strong motivator, as I learned in this season of my life. And yeah, so people who are afraid of those who are not mentally well, or even just ex-convicts or whatever the case may be. It's a strong enough factor for you to leave the area or even practice zoning. And I think this is the problem with NIMBYism, is that what these communities do, especially the richer communities that can afford to, is that they lobby the politicians for zoning laws for their communities that keep people out. And that is the heart of the problem with NIMBYism, is that you don't own the property, but you can lobby for zoning laws that can keep people and infrastructures out.
And just to make, again, I want to make sure let's steel man the argument for zoning. The simplest argument would be you don't want a steel shop next to your home residence, right? And so there's an aspect of you want to be able to sleep in your house in peace, and so good zoning laws make sure that businesses don't end up in a place that they're going to disrupt the residents. And again, this is sort of the steelman argument. Also would be the government central planners thought that we would be better off if you sort of have the business sector, you have residential sectors, and then you have some let's call them mixed, right? So you see some places where like the grocery stores on the bottom floor and then the apartment buildings above them. That would be kind of mixed. I know I'm oversimplifying it, but this is a very central planning approach. And so the zoning laws argument, I think there's an appropriate problem that is being addressed, or there's an appropriate concern that the society has that zoning laws tries to be the best solution for. I would say the critique of zoning laws is the level of detail is absurd, right? To the point of like, zoning law 45.6-1.A-B, like just insane. Like if you've ever looked at a zoning law, you just have to start looking at the number of specificities. It's not like residential here. And so this is where your point, right? So how does, the wealthy protect? Well, they don't allow, let's say, multifamily dwellings to be built in their neighborhood, right? So you only have single residence properties. You can't build a, quadplex or duplex because the zoning laws prevent it. And so this is sort of the counter or sort of the way that they achieve what you're talking about. So hopefully I've done a little bit of justice to give zoning laws some context for the audience. But what else would you say the zoning laws play into this, or how else?
Yeah, no, well, it's just one of those facets where, you look at just property rights and that people are trying to take over property that they don't own. Right. And that was new to me as I was studying this. I was kind of like, oh, wait a minute. But I didn't know that this was a thing. I know for me personally, like, yeah, I would definitely be a NIMBY, but not to the point where I'm taking over property that I don't own. But I think people do have a right to say, hey, look, as a community, even like, I think about Mike Bibby, who used to play in the NBA, and so it's crazy. We got to definitely put this in the show notes. So basically, he owns like a neighborhood almost. He owns a neighborhood, and his siblings and his family all live on the same block, right? Right. So
I love it.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's like he's like, oh, across the street, that's my cousin. My brother's over there. My brother's over there. My mom's over here. Yeah, and then he's like, yeah, and then the kids, all of our cousins, all the kids just be out in the street, and you play with your cousins right there in the street, and everybody can see everybody. Everybody has their own home.
And when someone's visiting your neighbor, they're already like family, right? Like, you've already got a sense.
Yeah.
Well, but my point is, like, someone visiting my family, oh, okay, I trust them.
Right. So, but now, now you're thinking about not in my backyard, and NIMBYism, and them saying, okay, well, we want to keep this area safe and so forth. So I understand that. But again, there's give and take with NIMBYism and what we're seeing with the 30 new shelters and people's safety. Now, the flip side of the coin is gentrification, right? And this is the bad word in regards to social justice ideology. And so basically, gentrification, for those who don't know, gentrification is a process of changing the character of a neighborhood through the influx of more affluent residents and businesses. It is a common and controversial topic in politics and in urban planning. When I first heard about it, it was presented to me as revitalization. Right? They're going to revitalize a bad neighborhood. And it sounds great, right? It's a political term, right? You're like, oh, that sounds great. But then you start to saying, okay, wait, but what about the people who can't afford to live there anymore? Now, in some cases in our context, Joel, for people who are at Regent Park, which used to be a pretty rough neighborhood,
Yep.
has been cleaned up, and the people they basically have mixed housing. So you have the people who own the actual property and the people who are renting. So you're mixing the people, and it isn't like, okay, we got to cross the train tracks to get to the ghetto type thing. So they're mixing the government housing with the normal housing. And so you can't tell the difference where the hood is and where it's not. So that's really awesome. And the area looks really amazing. New basketball courts, soccer fields, all that, chess tables. It looks amazing. Now, of course, that's the positive of it, but the heart of people's problem with gentrification is that you're basically displacing and pushing people out who were there first.
Yeah, and I mean, I can understand someone who says, I didn't have a choice. I had to move. And, essentially being in a place where you're like, I grew up, or I wanted my kids to finish growing up in this neighborhood, but now I can't stay here any longer, and feeling, powerless in that regard. That is, I can appreciate that, frustration, and I wouldn't want to be in that place, and I don't want to wish that on anyone. the question becomes fundamentally like, what are the causes? And I think, this is where people don't understand the downfall of zoning laws, right? Because zoning laws are also by half of your city being zoned for a particular type of neighborhood, you're potentially limiting the supply of houses. So the best example of sort of like the counterpoint to all this, I have an article I'll put in the show notes page. It's Houston's lack of zoning laws will help it rebuild. So in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey, so this was 2017, by not having zoning laws, it allows for a quicker change of their city, and you get a little bit more eclectic. Whereas what you've talked about with gentrification is much less, it's government sponsored, right? And this is where the problem, so the big problem I see with zoning laws is it becomes a barrier to entry to whether it's home renovations, whether it's even just repurposing your house. So the issue is, or sorry, the highlighting factor for me is the second biggest donor to government behind pharmaceutical is land developers. Why? Change in zoning laws. So
But sorry, how does that relate to gentrification? Going back to NIMBYism.
So part of the issue is that, I'll try to use a simple example. If I have a property that is worth $100,000 in its current zoning laws, but if I could change the zoning law, that property might be worth $300,000. The person who has access to changing the zoning law is rent seeking, or they're using their government relationships.
Rent seeking? What do you mean rent seeking?
So rent seeking is the idea that you lobby government in order to
Okay,
profit.
Well, you can see why that's misleading.
Yes, I know. Okay, so I'll put this link in the show.
If the person owns the home, then,
The term rent seeking is a legacy economic term. There's a link. I'll put it in the show notes page. The best example, I did this on another show already too. So they use the term privilege seeking, but it's a term. Rent seeking is used to describe people's lobbying of government to give them special privileges.
Yeah, but what does that have to do with gentrification?
When the property is worth $100,000 in the current purpose, meaning the current people who live there, and the value of the property could become $300,000 if I change the zoning law, the people who currently live there get screwed. And there's an incentive for someone to come along and change the neighborhood. And it's rather than the people who live there, start to realize, hey, guess what? The value of my property has gone up. Maybe I could remortgage or take a second mortgage or take a mortgage and pay for the renovation.
Yeah. Okay. No, I see what you're saying. I guess the way I'm looking at gentrification is in regards to a metropolitan, inner city core, government housing, people that are renting versus for example, on my block, I'm in Brampton. So everybody owns their home here.
Yep.
And the people who not to say there aren't people are renting, but they already know what the deal is.
Yeah, they've got a relationship with the renter or the landlord.
Yeah, so that's what I was saying. It was a bit confusing. So that's what I was saying. Like in regards to gentrification.
So bring that along to so zoning laws the point I'm trying to demonstrate is that the zoning laws make things very restrictive. Those who have access to change the zoning laws have special privileges. So that's sort of part of the nature. The other aspect is the things like rent control that have a good intention, but they don't. The problem is that they cause the landlord to say, well, I've got 1,000 people lined up to pay $500 a month. Why am I going to spend money to upgrade this property or even upkeep this property? I can't increase the rent or I have to wait for this person to move out before I can increase the rent. And so they have no incentive to keep the person there. They only want to do the bare minimum to keep the tenant there. So the point I'm trying to also make is that because of the restrictive zoning laws, the government has to come in to then do the revitalization project because they didn't allow the neighborhood to
Wait, hold on. Wait, well, sorry, not to cut you off, but I just wanted to make sure we're straight. So, I always saw revitalization done by companies rather than the government.
well, and I mean, again, goes back to like zoning, right? Government is deeply involved if zoning is restrictive, because you can't revitalize something when it has a particular purpose. Again, go back to my example. Let's say every house in the neighborhood is a bungalow. It's a relatively, medium to low income neighborhood because none of the houses are massive. But now the government comes in to change with the developers who are going to make the changes, right? So your neighbor is now someone who is someone different, but they have changed. The zoning law has been done with the developer.
Okay.
Or sorry, the zoning law has been changed with the developer. So as much as, these companies come in, generally speaking, these companies are coming in with relationship with government, right? The government has, at least the city government, maybe not federal or provincial or state or whatnot, but the city government has recognized, hey, this is an area of our neighborhood that needs revitalization. And the city is deeply involved with those projects. Now, the intention or the goal might be to improve. My point is that because of all of the restrictions they've put in place in the first place, you're having this shift in properties going from $100,000 in value to $300,000 in value because of the change in the law. And if the zoning law was very lax, these changes would be happening slowly over time. You would have a house here make a change. Maybe one slightly richer person moves in, and you just start to have, like what you described in your neighborhood, a mixed sort of, you were talking about Regent Park. You have this sort of mixed dynamic
Housing,
that nobody can tell. Well, that happens naturally when the zoning laws allow for individual houses to be changed. Let's say someone tears down a house and builds a fourplex. So now 4 people could live on the block, whereas maybe every other house on the street is a bungalow. Well, does that really change things significantly? Okay. No. But you start to see small little changes. But the other side of this is that when if the change continues to be significant, that the neighborhood becomes more valuable, the property owner already reaps the value because they don't have to change the zoning law. But when the zoning law becomes a hindrance, the value gets given to the person who can change the zoning law. And this is where, again, I always look at things on a so much more fundamental level. And I know maybe some people are going to say, Joel, you're missing the point of, gentrification. Maybe, but I'm saying,
they're probably saying that.
but my point is, I'm going back to the fundamentals of the environment that created the scenario that caused or that created an incentive to gentrify a neighborhood. And if we can, because so many times we look at the symptom and go, oh, the symptom's a problem. Okay, well, what caused the symptom?
Okay.
And it's too easy to just say, oh, well, people moved in and changed the neighborhood.
Okay.
Well, why did that?
In your opinion, is gentrification a bad thing?
It is, again, my first thought is depends on how you're going to define it. If you're going to define it as, people being displaced because the city or the location has sort of moved past them or someone has changed the neighborhood.
So, it's a metropolitan context. Gentrification is a process of changing the character of a neighborhood through the influx of more affluent residents and businesses.
So it's a bad thing for the people who are getting pushed out. 100%.
Nah.
And for those that get pushed out,
nah.
But again, I go, well, why are they getting pushed out? Because government is doing things.
Nah.
Right?
Nah. those 2 things I disagree with. That government is doing things, because I would say that the government was actually helping them and letting them stay in subsidized housing and possibly finding them new ones. But the other thing is, I wouldn't say, I forgot what your first point was, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily.
So, is it a bad thing? If you're asking me, is it immoral? Is it a sin? That's a different question. I'm saying it's a bad thing that these type of scenarios occur.
Gentrification? Yes, because I would say that it's a normal progression of cultural development.
I would say it's a normal development when government is so restrictive in their zoning laws.
No,
I would. That's my point. My point is that
what I'm saying is that it's a natural progression because Tyra and I saved up our money and we're looking for a place to live, and we found a lot that we can afford, and so we're going into a gentrified neighborhood to buy our first place.
Okay,
that's normal. I don't see where what the problem is with that.
So and in that sense, I would say, if I narrow sort of it down, is changing neighborhoods bad? No. Is houses and property over time being revitalized a good thing? Yes, that means that buildings won't fall down when people live in them. So there's
and I have a place to go play basketball.
Right. So are there aspects of redevelopment that are good? Yes. My point is that they happen abruptly in the scenarios that we call gentrification because of government. And in that sense, because of the government zoning laws, because of how restrictive they are, because of multiple things that the government is so deeply. So and this is where, rent control, again, I know, probably rent control is a bit of a deeper issue that I'd have to unpack, maybe even personally with a one-on-one conversation. But the point I'm trying to demonstrate is
hold on. I believe rent control does more harm than good, and it makes the ghetto.
Yeah, and that's, but this is where I'm saying rent control is an aspect of this conversation.
Yeah, I believe that.
So my point is that gentrification occurring is a symptom of a bigger problem,
which is
the amount of government regulation on housing.
Which would say what that regulation is.
Zoning laws.
Well, I thought you were going to make the argument for rent control rather than zoning laws.
No, well, I mean to some extent, they both play a factor in the same scenario. Right,
because I would say that rent control plays more of a factor in making the ghetto, and so that way, the property value drops because the cost for living there doesn't add up for the price for what it costs to maintain the place, and so the property value drops, and so now people are able to move in, or even companies being able to come in and create infrastructure that basically prices the people out. That's how I see it.
Well, and to some extent, what you're saying though is the way that they get around the rent control ends up being by rezoning the property. Right, to some extent. So, for example,
I wouldn't say rezoning, because part of it is if a company's if a contracting company, a construction company is trying to get a permit to put up a condo, I don't understand how that's zoning.
Because before they went there, the property had a different use, and they couldn't build a condo until the government changed the use of the land. So,
but that's not NIMBYism.
No, but my point is, it's related to the issue, right? So, and so this is where it's again, what was the intention of zoning law? Okay, but the unintended consequence. So, is the deep level of regulation actually is so burdensome that people can't even comprehend the burden.
Sorry, what burden?
The burden being, so regulation, generally speaking, if you think of it on a very high level, the regulation is to prevent, it's sort of like the historical sense, the fence law idea, right? So to prevent someone from sinning, we have a fence law. To prevent some harm from occurring, we create this zoning law. So the example I gave earlier was that I don't want a mechanic to open up a shop by tearing down his house and building a little warehouse in the middle of a residential neighborhood. And the way that we do that is by zoning laws. But again, that's why I said, if you honestly go look at a zoning law, it will blow your mind. The number of pages. It is it's not like, hey, zones, it's not like they have 5 zones.
But is it bad for who though?
It's bad for anyone who can't get a zoning law changed, which is basically everyday people.
But why
It's
would
only
they-
the wealthy.
But I guess I'm thinking because I'm not wealthy, because I'm just thinking like, how does a zoning law? Yeah, technically you're talking about zoning apart from NIMBYism.
Well, yes and no. I mean, they're like, as part of the
Well,
zoning.
what do you mean yes or no? It's just one or the other, man.
Okay, because zoning, the way that zoning is approved creates NIMBYisms being empowered. Because I can go to my city hall meeting where the zoning law is going to get changed for Joe Schmo to build a slightly higher shed than was permitted and say,
Not shed.
no, but dude, this is the type of thing that zoning laws cause. Literally, they go to city council to get approved for the size of their shed because technically their shed exceeds the regulation.
No, I'm not talking about a shed. I mean like a condo.
I know. I'm just
Or
saying,
like
but
or
this
like
is
a Max Milk or
this,
a 7-Eleven.
the point was, the point I'm trying to make is, if the regulations were as simple as like, hey, we have 5 different type of zones in sort of in the line of what you're talking about, and commercial, residential and mixed, and then sort of, let's say, anything that's a really loud commercial, like manufacturing, right? If it was limited to that sort of sense of zoning, someone could argue, hey, this is rational, it helps protect people, make sure that they're not working beside a noisy or living beside a noisy factory. But my point is that the NIMBYism, the reason why someone can even say not in my backyard is because when Walmart wants to come, they have to get zoning approval.
I agree.
So they got to go now, like, whether or not you want Walmart in your town is a little bit more complicated. But my point is that by the fact that people go to city council to say, no, this guy can't do this, not in my backyard. Like, the not in my backyard happens in front of council for zoning law complaints.
But sorry, how does this relate to gentrification?
So in the gentrification scenario, my biggest point is that the reason you have abrupt changes is because of the government regulation. Zoning laws is like the primary means of the regulation, right? Rent control comes into that as well. But this is where the zoning law also is the fact that, so it's the other half of the city is where the rich people can live. The fact that I can't, as a developer, can't tear down a rich house and build 4 houses on the same property is also why gentrification occurs. Because it's a housing issue in terms of number of people being housed, density of population, all of these things that play a role. It's like,
but that's natural demography in regards to how people flow towards.
It would be natural.
But okay, let me ask you this.
In a Houston scenario, that's why I shared the Houston or mentioned the Houston article, because it's the lack of zoning laws helps it rebuild.
Okay.
Because
so for the listener who sees gentrification as a problem, is it a sin to be a gentrifier?
So I think to me, I look at the individual actors. If I can look, okay, so let's look at an individual actor, someone who wants to buy a property and let's say change it, renovate it, build it up. So they're the one moving into the neighborhood that is underprivileged or that needs revitalization, as it's been called. Their motivation, I don't see anything in their motivations that I can judge as impure. Now, if they said, "Oh, there's people in this neighborhood that I hate, and I just want to move in to torture them," okay, fine. But I don't think those aren't really the people that qualify in these scenarios, or at least they're the few and far between. What about the seller? Same thing. What are their motivations? Are they trying to, if they have a tenant who's renting from them and they're like, I hate this person, I just want to get rid of them. I'm going to, I'm going to tell them at the last possible second, I'm going to basically treat them like garbage. Okay. Then I can look at their motives, or if I'm going to judge whether what they're doing is sinful, I got to look at their motives. I can't just look at I would say, let's say the actors within gentrification scenarios, their individual actions are amoral. To me, it all comes down to motives.
Okay, because the argument is that gentrification, being a gentrifier, is a sin because you are basically taking over a place where somebody once stayed. So like we see examples of this. There was a video Black Lives Matter, was telling some white people to leave their homes and give it to black people because they were, basically using their privilege, and it's time to balance the books. And so they're in the wrong in living in a gentrified neighborhood where black people used to live. So they would be wrong for being gentrifiers.
Well, and I think, again, I go back to look at if you're going to judge someone based on the color of their skin and some legacy stuff, well, to me, that's not really the appropriate standard for judging someone. So I think that's why I said, is gentrification as a whole a bad thing? Yes, I think it's a bad thing because the abrupt change that occurs, to me, is the symptom of a bigger problem.
But Joel, when you say abrupt, it sounds a bit arbitrary. Like abrupt sounds very relative, as opposed to what do you mean? Like the change happens in a day?
No, but I mean
years, 2 years, 5 years.
Yeah, I think of a 5-year time span.
But that's not abrupt, man.
No, but I'm talking okay, so the street that I live on right now has a lot of bungalows. But I've lived here for 5 years. You have a couple renovations where, some of them are no longer bungalows. Right. And so I would say a slow transition where over 20 to 30 years is natural. Nah. Meaning houses get torn down. I mean, obviously
not here in Brampton, buddy.
Yeah, but you got to remember Brampton. Yeah. But you got to remember the age of your city is newer than Mississauga.
Yeah. But sorry, my point is that all I'm saying is that, you're saying abrupt change, but all that seems pretty relative, especially, for the areas that we live in. Those things change happens very, very quick in regards to how fast a condo can get put up, especially when we go downtown. When you go downtown Toronto and you turn around, you're like, oh, wait, what the heck? Where did this come from?
Yeah. And so I guess my point, though, is that if you took a city, a block that was poor and literally, or let's say it was 3 or 4 city blocks, and now all of a sudden all the houses are gone and 4 condos are there. Mm-hmm. My point is that, one, the people who lived there before didn't get appropriately compensated because the value of selling their house was predominantly the land underneath it. Not because arguably, I'm assuming, based on the scenario we're talking about, their houses would be considered tear downs.
But sorry, but Joel, even when I look at this, it's crazy because where I live in Brampton, right? So they have these new houses being put up, but then you have these old ratty homes that been there for years, and so develop, these people, and they're not selling. Of course, they're not going to sell their property because they're taking their last stand. But Tyra and I always talk about it. But they're like, yeah, how much you want to bet? They have their kids are probably thinking, as soon as dad's dead, yeah, we're cashing in on this property. So my point being is that for people who own their property, eventually that price goes up and eventually the people sell. That's my point. Eventually the people sell and they get what their property is worth. But, and you said this to me before, that if somebody's renting, you're getting nothing. And you have to leave. You don't own the place. You have no right to say I need to be compensated. Even the idea of that. I mean, I'll shelter isn't mandatory.
Well, yeah, but dude, I mean, if your landlord knows what's good for them, right? What depends on the scenario, right? If you're selling your house and someone else is planning to move in, technically the dilemma is as a landlord. If you're not selling a teardown, if you're selling a teardown, then yeah, your tenant's basically going to get screwed because there's nothing they can do.
Yeah, no, but the context, especially as it appeals to the hot button issue of gentrification, it isn't people who own their property; it's people who are renting.
So yeah, but my point is, the point I was trying to get to was, if you're in a property that let's say somebody else is going to rent it, or sorry, the landlord's going to sell it to someone else who's going to, let's say, renovate it and move in or whatnot. The landlord has an incentive, if they want to sell faster, to have no tenant. My parents were compensated 2.5 months rent to move out within a month. So it's hey, you just gave me first and last at my next property to leave in a month. So I would say to some extent, yeah, is it unfortunate that they're having to move out? Okay, fine. But, as a tenant, I mean, I would say, yeah, some people are, and we can sort of get into the conversation around, what can you do not to be a tenant? But some people are tenants because there's value in being a tenant. One of the values is that I can move at a month's notice, right? Like, it's not like being a land or a, property owner is, all benefits, no negatives when you try to compare that with being a tenant. To be honest, I'm a tenant and I love it, and for a number of reasons. And when I say I love it, I mean,
yeah, but what about the people who are tenants and who are being forced out on the street for other people who have money and don't love it and don't love being a tenant? So that's the problem, right?
Yeah,
it comes back to property rights and people owning, having property and how they're using the property.
Well, and this is where the dilemma becomes, well, what is the cause? Right? What's the real, so for the individuals, so I mean, we kind of went back and forth quite a bit on zoning laws and all that stuff, because
you went back and forth.
I know. I'm a nerd. I'm way too much into it. I'm sure some of the listeners are like, oh my goodness, just move on.
No.
But
you're fine.
Yeah. So, I mean, but the point is, right? Like, if we look at those individuals, in their circumstances, what is the cause of them being in the place where they're having to rent? And I can't know the answer, right? Like, some people, there's it's like they don't have any parents, like their whole family is, let's say they've immigrated from another country and like they're just barely surviving. Okay. Like, those scenarios exist. And I mean, I would say that's, for the people who are barely getting by, from a society perspective, that's the role of charity. That's the role of fraternity. There is a need for us to take care of people that are, underprivileged of one capacity or another.
Yeah. And that's why I'm looking at it from a perspective of renters and buyers and people who actually can afford to live somewhere and own the property. Because if they own the property, then they would have a right to the property. But if you don't own it and you're renting, you don't have a right or a stake on the property.
Well, and I would say, you know what, in Canada though, like, dude, you have way more rights as a tenant than you do as a mortgage holder. So, as a tenant, it would take you 4 months to be kicked out for delinquent rent. As a mortgage holder, if you don't pay your mortgage, within 45 days, the bank can sell your house.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's fine. But in regards to
my point is,
yeah, but
in terms of gentrification, in terms of the people living in their house, if you like legit in terms of being kicked out, you have more rights as a tenant than you do as a property owner. Yeah.
But I guess the argument people are making is that with gentrification, for people who are renting, they're being put out, and so that's the bad thing, that they're being displaced and put somewhere else. Because sometimes it's not even they're able to get back into mixed housing. Sometimes they're pushed out further, and hence why we have Brampton today. And Brampton is the way it is. We have a lot of black people living in Brampton now because most of those black people left the city and were able to get loans and buy homes out here.
Yeah, and I mean, what I I don't want to like throw anyone under the bus when I make this comment, but for someone at the lower level of the income scale, I don't think it's appropriate to just expect to be able to buy wherever you want.
No, I know, I don't think that's the issue.
No, but my point is,
people who are being displaced. But see, the heart of the gentrification issue and why people are so pissed off isn't that people are being removed from their government housing and then being able to go buy houses. That's not the situation, right? So the heart of the issue is that people are concerned that people are living in government housing and they are being displaced by people who have the money to do that. That's the problem.
Well, but I mean, at the end of the day, the government was the one who. So if it's government housing, it's the government who's changing the house from no longer be like for it to be sold, right? Like the government's the one who put them there in the first place. Only the government can remove them if it's government housing.
Well, unless they're moved to another area, and that's what people are concerned with. Because people have their whole livelihood in the area. So if you're living in Regent Park and now
deciding that they need, like,
Yeah,
right?
but
the government's the one
but,
who's
but government isn't
pulling the
wrong for
trigger.
doing that. There just isn't space for it.
well, and you know, again, it's the dilemma is the government housing solution an effective solution?
No. What do you mean by effective?
So again, would we be, as a society, as a whole, as a collective, you know, when I say collective, I mean like human prosperity in the long run, would we be better off without government housing but private charity handling these scenarios? And I mean,
okay, you could write a blog post about what people should do to if they're not living in the hood anymore.
no, but my point was just simply, is government housing the right solution? I'm asking the question because this is a consequence of the government solution. You're never going, like, when the government creates the solution, at the whim of a politician, they can say, oh, we're going to do it differently. And you're stuck. You have no control. You have no power.
Okay, well, I don't know about you, but I love government housing. I grew up in government housing. It is crucial, man.
No, again,
crucial, bro.
is the concept that government housing addresses important for society? Absolutely. My question is the way that government housing is currently done the way to do it for the best for human prosperity? Because the point I'm trying to get at is, wouldn't a solution that leads to home ownership, not by government, be better than government housing?
Mm-hmm. But what does that look like?
A great question.
Right? Because, you know, and that's universal from everywhere, from Canada to the US. The government housing system is all the same. It's still fixed income based on where you're at in life. If you are unemployed, then it's all gravy.
So,
But
I mean,
if you start to make more money, then you basically have to leave.
well, and this is where, and this is the term is welfare cliff. Right. So, like, again, this is where the government housing solution becomes a problem, because they basically force you to say, like, well, I can't afford to get the more expensive job because I lose my housing. So I'm going to keep working as the fry cook at McDonald's instead of taking the manager position because now I lose my housing. Mm-hmm. Right. Again, my point is that, like, we don't look at the whole picture of a government solution and sort of ask the question, is this the way to do it? Right. So let me, the one thing I did want to say, gentrification, right? You talk about people being pushed out. Well, one of there's a concept within sort of the, let's say, real estate wealth building approach of the term called house hacking. And this is where I would say to any of our young listeners, maybe downtown Toronto is not the place to try to do this, but when let's say you can barely afford a mortgage, well, one of the way to do that would be this concept of house hacking would be, there's different degrees to this. Someone who's like me, let's say I would buy a house and I put a basement apartment in it. It is an example of house hacking. I'm sort of I'm using my house to create income to help pay the mortgage. The extreme example of house hacking would be like, hey, I'm going to go to school somewhere. I'm going to buy a house and have all my roommates basically give all the best rooms. I'll take the worst room possible. And now they're all paying the mortgage. Okay. And I'm living for free.
Sorry, what does this have to do with gentrification?
Well, your point was about renters. So own the house. I'm talking about other ways to own the house, right? So people sort of look at, well, I need to make X dollars in order to own the house. Well, if you can go to the bank with a business plan to demonstrate I'm buying a house in, basically across the street from my school. Here are the 4 people who are going to live with me already. They're, my roommates from whatever year. And now you set up basically a school off-campus residence. Yeah. You're going to have more income than your rent, your mortgage.
But, Joel, in my blog post, I did Black Love, White Lies, and I talked about the 3 types of people within each ethnic group: the achiever, non-achiever, and the deviant. And my point is that if you're an achiever, a person delayed gratification, a person who works hard, delayed gratification, and versus the person who's a non-achiever who instant gratification and doesn't really work hard, and then the deviant who disobeys laws and doesn't want to work hard. But if you are an achiever and you're in government housing, you won't be there for long and you'll necessarily end up turning into a gentrifier. A person who is living in government housing, whether they be deviant or a non-achiever, one of the things the non-achiever is lacking is financial literacy, to be able to go to the bank, get a loan, and then have the foresight to say, okay, you know what, I'm going to buy a house out of Waterloo and rent it out to those college kids. I really think that there's a divide. There's a reason why a person is a gentrifier, and there's a reason why somebody is in the hood. They're in the hood for a reason, and they can't get out, nor do they want to get out.
And I mean, I would say wanting to get out, sometimes there's, the one thought that I have is, in economics, we use the term of moral hazard, right? Have moral hazard being the idea that you incentivize a moral hazard, meaning you incentivize bad behavior, right? So, are you creating a scenario where the person who makes the mistake, let's say an intentional mistake, right? So they're not punished for their mistakes. And so now there's no consequence for making that mistake. You've created a moral hazard because people don't have to bear the consequences. And so you've essentially incentivized people to be deviants, or you incentivize them to be
right. And my point is just that it's not necessarily that, sometimes some people want to leave the block. They want to leave, but because of the lack of financial literacy and the skills of delayed gratification and hard work, they're not able to leave. And my point is just that you're stuck being the person who is being removed from your home versus the person who had foresight to finish school, get married, not have kids, save money, pay down debt, right? Invest well, and be able to afford a nice condo within the city. And my point is that, that's what you were saying about house hacking. That's great, but that's not for the people who are being displaced. That's what I'm saying. So let me ask you this. What's your 2 cents on the issue?
I think there's, if we look at both gentrification and, NIMBYs, I think there are fundamental issues that we don't ask questions about. We focus on the symptoms, being, people not wanting the homeless and mental health issues in their neighborhood. We focus on the people displaced, and we sort of look at those and kind of go, okay, we see, a symptom, and we sort of look at the symptom and look for an individual direct cause, and we're sort of done with the problem. I think, again, maybe people will say I'm probably too critical of government, but I think people are too trusting.
They'll say that?
People are probably a little bit too trusting, too willing to just give the government the benefit of the doubt because their intentions might be good. But the question becomes, for me, the 2 cents is when you have issues like this, it's important to understand the entire landscape that this situation's occurring in, because if you misidentify the cause, none of your solutions will actually create change. So, on the 6 cents makes change bandwagon, you have to understand the underlying situation. You have to understand and determine cause and effect properly if you really want to address the cause. Because in my opinion, addressing the cause is the only way that you ever actually make change. What about you? What's your 2 cents on this issue?
Well, for me, the way I look at it is that private ownership of property is a blessing. So to say it's an evil, rather opting for like a communism, where no one owns anything, but everyone owns everything, is a sin. So God gave all people a command in Genesis chapter 1, 26 and 28 to use his creation to the best of their ability. This is why he gave us the 8th commandment. Exodus chapter 20, verse 15, thou shalt not steal, which implies we all have property in some form or fashion. So theologically speaking, I'm saying that
taxation is theft. I'm just kidding.
No. What I'm saying theologically speaking is that stewardship is a moral responsibility. Economically speaking, economics is the science of making choices. And we all know in theory and in practice that some people make foolish decisions concerning their property. Now, some thrive and some dive. So when it comes to gentrification, as the great Joel Jeezy once said, the issue isn't that renters have to leave their property, but that they don't own their property. So as a result of densification, where a lot of people are moving into the area, and development, they have to leave. So now, as it relates to the gentrifier, it shouldn't be a sin to be a good steward. So the Adam Hengels of market urbanism, he said it this way, and I quote, "The reason people gentrify is not to disrupt ethnic or economically challenged neighborhoods. It is likely because they have been priced out of the neighborhood they desire." So like I said prior, it's basic economics and divine providence, densification and development. Now, and when we look at, as it relates to NIMBYs, right? Not in my backyard people, it's a rational response to the risk of home ownership. But if you don't own the property of the surrounding area, that's unfair to lobby politicians to zone the area of the neighborhood, especially if the government is lobbying on behalf of those less fortunate. And now finally, creation began in a garden and ends in a city. So for me, I look forward to the new heavens and new earth, where the ultimate judge will grant everybody their own lot, yet everyone will be satisfied because they'll have an unlimited amount of God.
That's good, bro. That's really good.
Let us know what you guys think.
Yeah, give us your 2 cents. Hit us up at 6 Cents Report,
At
Facebook, and gmail.com.
And on Twitter, man. You know, I love Twitter. Twitter is where all the action happens. So if you're not on Twitter, we don't usually do this, but I would convince you to get on Twitter. Get off of Instagram, get off of Facebook, get on Twitter and follow us. That's where all the action is.
That's the cesspool of conversation.
Yeah, I enjoy. I've enjoyed my stay on Twitter, and that's where me and Joel get most of our action. So, if you want to continue to build with us on social media, the weapon of choice. I don't know, Joel, if you would say the weapon of choice. Weapon of choice for these kind of things is definitely Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, I'm getting more and more fed up with social media in general, but yeah, no, I mean, my weapon of choice is conversation. I like to really understand other people. So whatever method, coffee might be the best, but in general, whatever method I can, ask questions to challenge other people's thoughts, so that I can understand really why they think what they think.
Yeah. So let us know your 2 cents, guys. Thank you for your support. Continue to subscribe. Yes, we have a lot of people who are listening, but they're not subscribed. So
subscribe, please. Comment, share.
Give us a review.
Yeah, that too.
Please.
On that note, 6 cents makes change.
But you heard me? Does that make sense?